Hello and welcome to, finally, another episode of Know Your Enemy with Sour Peppers. Things have been pretty crazy lately, sort of messing up my schedule, but here we are now. I really want to start doing daily uploads. Hopefully once I get this damn move out of the way, I'll be able to. But anyways, so today we're looking at the Tier 2 Yank tanks. From the Stuart to the Sherman, we'll look at some of the background and various armor and modules inside that you can target for greatest effect. During the Second World War, the strategy of the Americans adopted for tank design was somewhat similar to the philosophy that the Soviets had, by putting emphasis on production and numbers ahead of overall quality and sophistication. Not that they were bad tanks per se, and obviously history has shown us that the strategy was the correct one. As far as general tank doctrine at the outset of war, as laid out in the 1920 Amendment to the National Defense Act, all tanks would be assigned to infantry rather than operating in dedicated and autonomous tank corps. The sole purpose would be to support the infantry in their advance. Events in Europe throughout the interwar period did little to alter this mindset. During the same period, the Americans didn't put as much emphasis on armor R&D as the British did, at least in the early 30s anyways, and eventually the Germans. Forward-looking tank developments like Walter Christie's new suspension system were disregarded by the US military for the most part. However, that all changed after the Battle of France. But since we have quite a lot to cover in this video, we'll now get into the tanks themselves. And here we are, starting with the Stuart M5A1 light tank. Now, as far as the armor goes on this thing, for a light tank of the time, it's actually pretty decent. You have to remember that at the time that this tank was first developed, anti-tank guns were of relatively small caliber compared to what they would develop to be during the Second World War very quickly. At the front here, we have sloped 28mm armor, giving you an effective thickness of around 40mm. At the bottom, we have an effective thickness of a rather impressive 87mm. At the side, pretty thin. I mean, 30mm, it's not going to be very hard to penetrate that from a good angle. If you're angled more, it can actually be a bit tricky. I mean, you're at 90mm effective thickness at this angle, and almost 50mm at the front, around 30 on the turret. All in all, it's not that difficult to penetrate this thing, but even with most of the guns from this tier, 40mm isn't exactly difficult to penetrate, nor is anywhere else on the tank. So the main thing that we want to look at is the modules inside. Now, like always with modules inside the tank, I like to associate them with features on the exterior to help me remember where they are. For example, looking at the side of the Stuart, we have these ammunition storage areas right here, right above the suspension for the road wheels. The second suspension for the road wheels, pretty easy to remember, basically right in this area. Hopefully you can see my mouse. I know on some videos it doesn't show up. So that's a fairly easy one to remember, and it's the same on both sides. So you just have to remember the second sort of suspension thingy. I'm not sure exactly what this is called. Right there. If we're looking at the front of the vehicle, you can either aim for this small ammunition storage on the right of the tank right here. Fairly easy to remember. You just have to remember that it is on the right. Or you could, if you are feeling rather lucky, you can go for this small ammunition storage right in the center, right under this small sort of bulge in the top armor, directly below that. Well, about, let's say, a foot below that. You want to be aiming. Bit tricky because the ammunition stores are rather small on this thing. And of course, at the back here we have the fuel tanks in this raised section on the back deck of the tank. Very large area if you want to hit the fuel tanks, and the engine is right below it in the usual spot that you would find the engine. The M2 Stuart light tank served from 1935 to 1942. It was created during a time when the US put very little funding into the tank divisions of the country. By the time the Second World War came around, it was already obsolete with its 37mm anti-tank gun, which actually has pretty good velocity at 883 meters per second and thin armor protection. It saw very limited use in the war, mainly in the Pacific theater, where enemy armor was far less advanced than it was in the European theater. The design originated as the M1 combat car mounted with a mere 50 caliber a few 50 caliber machine guns. The Spanish Civil War, however, proved that such tanks mounted with only machine guns were completely ineffective in combat, and they decided to mount the 37mm anti-tank gun on something very similar to the M1 combat car with armor improvements. As I said before, most Stuarts sent into battle were in the Pacific theater. Other than that, it was mainly used for training tank crews in the United States itself before crews were sent overseas. Eventually, even in the Pacific theater, it was determined that their gun was not powerful enough to take out the Japanese bunkers, so it was replaced with tanks armed with the 75mm gun. Next on our list, we have the M22 Locust, a light tank designed by the Americans, primarily for use by the British airborne divisions. It was intended to be either dropped, or not dropped, but unloaded via aircraft or glider. Because of that, it has generally thinner armor than even the Stuart did. At the front, we have 12mm sloped armor with an effective thickness of 26mm. At the bottom, we have an effective thickness of 26 on the flat surface, and a little more when you get down here at more of a slope at 60mm. The turret is probably the most heavily armored part of the vehicle, with effective thicknesses about between 30 and 35mm. The side of the tank, well, it's thin, pretty much anything's going to be able to penetrate it, minus smaller caliber machine guns. As for modules on the inside of the vehicle, it's actually somewhat similar to the M5A1. You have this ammunition, which is right above this second suspension or unit for the rear two road wheels. And also you have another ammunition storage just to the right of it. So you can either aim above that or just to the right of it. From the other side, it's a bit different. It's one of those tanks where you have to remember which side is which. The ammunition is stored just to the up and left of that second suspension unit. And that is the left side of the tank. So on the left side, it is up and left to the rear suspension unit, and on the right, it is above and beside to the right of that rear suspension unit. From the front of the tank, it's actually a bit tricky to hit any ammunition because you have these lower, or this lower ammunition on the left is probably going to be hard to hit through the transmission of the vehicle. The best bet for trying to hit transmission in the front is probably to hit this ammunition storage that is stored in the middle of the tank. So basically you would be aiming, if you see there's sort of a plate here that is bolted on separate from the rest of the plate, you would want to be hitting just to the bottom right of that plate that you can see right here. But your best bet is to probably go for the crew. The loader, that's a pretty important one to hit if you're wanting to impede their offensive abilities. and that would be on the right side of the turret. He is on the right side of the turret. The driver is located to the bottom right, and the commander is located on the left of the turret. This is a 3-man crew: commander, loader, driver. So even getting one of these guys taken out will do a pretty good job at impeding their ability to effectively operate. And as usual, we have fuel tanks in the rear with the engine slightly pretty much the same area as them. So if you want to hit fuel tanks or the engine, that would work too. The M22 Locust was a light tank designed to be used as support for British airborne troops, purpose-built to be transported on the Hamilcar Mark I glider. The British War Office asked the Americans to produce a tank that would meet their requirements for this role. Originally they had planned to use their Tetrarch, however, they believed that a tank specifically built for the airborne role would be more preferable. It used the same 37mm anti-tank gun that the Stuart used, which by the time it entered service in 1942 it had limited effectiveness. Ineffectiveness seemed to be the theme of the M22 overall. The British Ordnance Department did extensive testing on the M22 throughout 1943 and 1944. During which a number of faults were found. One, that it took too long to load and unload from the C-54 that was expected to transport it, limiting it to only being unloaded at secure air bases where it wouldn't be targeted by the enemy. There was the Fairchild C-82 that was made specifically for the M22, but it didn't enter service until after the war ended. Its use in the field wasn't exactly stellar, with instances of gliders carrying an M22 breaking up in midair, sending the tank hurtling towards the ground. Some tanks would make it to the ground but be severely damaged in the process or flipping over, rendering the tank useless. Although they were meant to replace the Tetrarch, I don't even know. Airborne forces usually consisted of a combination of both the M22 and the Tetrarch. By 1946, the light tank was considered to be obsolete, although one could argue that it was obsolete much earlier than that. However, in 1948, the Egyptians used a sizable force of M22s during the Arab-Israeli War. In the end, it was used by Belgium, Egypt, Britain, and the United States. Now we have the first of these Shermans, the M4A1, which generally has pretty light armor, but it can be pretty tricky to penetrate if it's angled correctly. The front armor does utilize sloping armor. It's sort of similar to the T-35 with a thickness of 50mm and an effective thickness of almost 90. However, unlike the T-34, it does have flat armor towards the bottom with an effective thickness of only 50mm, which is probably going to be your best bet. The turret's pretty heavily armored at, between 80 and 100mm, and the side of the tank is fairly thin at 40mm. However, if angled correctly, that can go up to between 100 and 60mm depending on the angle. And of course, like usually, the rear is very lightly armored at 40mm. Now, as far as ammunition modules to hit, there are quite a few options you can go for. On the right side of the tank, you have this ammunition just to the right of the second suspension unit for the third and fourth road wheel. You have these ones up here, which are probably a bit easier to hit. If you look at that same suspension unit, it was just up and to the right on the right, and then a bit further left from the suspension unit there, about a foot further left. So basically right here and right here. Now, like I always say, I always like to try and memorize these modules by associating them with external features. multiple external features if possible. For example, with this one, you can remember that it is about a foot left of the suspension unit and below this little handle up here. From the left side of the tank, or your right, I guess, depending on where you are, you have this ammunition storage, which is directly above the third road wheel, just above the track. Right above the track. So the third road wheel, right above the track. I suppose you could also put it directly below the front of the turret as well. From the front of the vehicle, it's pretty easy to remember. You have ammunition storage to the right and to the left in around the same areas, towards the sides of the upper hull of the tank. Now, the armor can be pretty angled at these areas, but on the left you have this small area where it's a bit flatter with a effective thickness of around 60 millimeters. And if you hit there, you might hit the ammunition, but honestly, it's better to approach this thing from a slight angle like this, so it's only an effective thickness of around 60 millimeters, and you can hit that ammunition quite easily. And it's much the same story on the other side, except you don't have that sort of hump right there, but you can still penetrate in this area right here. And, you know, I'm not sure if they have this difference in game, but the Shermans used a more volatile fuel than a lot of other tanks did, so that's why they had a sort of reputation for going up in flames. So if that is actually included in the game, that difference, then the fuel tanks are a pretty good target. Now, the second Tier 2 Sherman is pretty darn easy to remember armor. Well, first we'll take a look at the armor. It is much the same thickness on the front. You have the same weak spot down here. We have these added armor plating over the flatter surfaces. Give it an effective thickness of around, let's say, 80 millimeters, but for a lot of the guns at this tier, that's not that difficult to penetrate. And those protect the crew inside. Now, as far as ammunition goes, it's pretty easy, because you basically just have these added armor plates that tell you exactly where the ammunition is. So, I don't really need to tell you that. If you want to hit the ammunition, you just have to hit one of these plates, assuming that you have a gun that is powerful enough to penetrate these plates. Ammunition on this side, and the two ammunition stores on this side. If you don't have a gun that's thick enough, you can also go for the ammunition that is just above the third road wheel right here. Although it's a bit tricky, a lot of times when you fire down there, your shell will hit the track or the suspension or something. But you can go for that option. You also have the small ammunition stored right under the butt of the aimer, which is directly above the middle suspension unit, just above this line right here between these two sets of plates. From the front of the tank, it's much the same deal with the last one. You have the ammunition stored on the left and the right. However, they have angled this a bit better on this one, so it's a bit more difficult to penetrate. But on the left, you do have this flat surface that protrudes, where it's pretty, you know, it may hit, it may not, but you can aim there to try and set off that ammunition on the left side of the tank. If you have enough penetration power to get through the 80 millimeters of armor, then no problem. Just look on the left and the right, basically, or you could say right where this handle is and right where this sort of bump protrusion is. The M4 Sherman and its many variants were the primary medium tank for the Americans and the Allies in general during the Second World War. It was a much needed response to the German Panzer III and IV, which were superior to the American designs at the time, being the M2 Stuart and the M2 medium tanks, mounted with the rather lacking 37mm anti-tank gun. There was also the M3 Lee that was basically a stopgap to use while the M4 was still being developed. They were forced to mount the 75mm gun on a sponson because American industry was unable to cast a turret large enough at the time. The first batch of M4s were put together at the Lima Locomotive Works and were shipped across the Atlantic for use by the British, with the exception of one that was handed over to the US Army for evaluation. Doctrine at the time stated that the primary role of tanks such as the Sherman would be infantry support. There are also some sources that indicate that the roles were actually reversed, that the infantry fulfilled the support role while the tanks were the primary force. The anti-tank role fell to the tank destroyers, on paper anyways, but we'll get into that a bit later. One characteristic of the Sherman tanks was that it was extremely loud, and you could take advantage of this fact in game. There have been quite a few times in realistic matches where I'll hear a Sherman coming, hide around a corner, and hit it as it comes by. You can use this in arcade matches too if you hear something coming and you can account for all the friendlies around you. Early Shermans, like the two M4A1 and the M4 in Tier 2, were equipped with the 75mm M3 general purpose cannon. Due to its lower muzzle velocity of around 600 meters per second, it could have some problems taking out hostile targets at longer ranges. Some think that was because the Sherman was actually intended mainly for soft targets firing HE rounds, because doctrine at the time states that anti-tank guns should be the primary way of taking out hostile tanks. But of course, in reality, the M4 was often the only one tasked with this job. And it's not bad at it either, in game at least. But there are certainly better guns. There is also the M4A3 with the 105mm howitzer, and the heat rounds you can unlock for it are pretty effective for its tier. Now, last but certainly not least, we have the M10 GMC motor carriage, basically. Gun carriage. Now, this thing has pretty light armor because the American anti-tank doctrine at the time was to have lightly armored vehicles with a powerful gun. So you have at the front around 60mm of effective thickness from the 40mm sloped armor, and down here you have around 80mm on the sloped area, but only 50 on the bottom where it's flat. On the side, well, first of all, the gun mantle is pretty thick. It's not the thickest gun mantle that I've ever seen, but 60mm or 80mm depending on the area and the slope. Now on the side turret is very thin. But before I forget, for aircraft, it's also good if you spot one of these while you're in an aircraft, is you can actually hit the crew from the open turret and do quite a bit of damage that way with just a gun with even 7.7s really. Now the side of the turret is 30mm, the side of the vehicle is around the same, 20mm. So it's not a particularly difficult vehicle to penetrate, just a little bit more difficult from the front. As far as ammunition storage goes, thankfully this is one of those vehicles where it's the same on both sides, so you don't have to remember different areas on each side. The ammunition is located either directly above the center suspension unit arm, just above the tracks, and then you have another one which is located above the 4th and 5th road wheel, just above the track. And it's the same on the other side, directly above the central suspension arm, and just above the track, and directly above the 3rd and 4th. Actually, no, I was wrong. It's the 4th and 5th road wheel. 4th and 5th road wheel. Sorry. Directly above them, just above the track. You also can go for another option, which is at the back of the turret. Smaller one to hit, but the armor is pretty thin back there. So, well, depending on the angle. That's a good one to hit if you're trying to get it from the rear. There's those two stored on either side of the turret. From the front, it's basically the same as a Sherman. You have ammunition stored on the right and the left on each side. And since this thing has a pretty potent gun, you may also want to remember the positions of the aimer and the loader to try and disable that gun, or at least slow its rate of reload. And they are both located on the right side of the turret, and one right behind the other. The GMC M10 was a tank destroyer produced by the United States, entering service in 1942 and nicknamed the Wolverine by the British. Based on the chassis of the M4 Sherman, it sported an open-top turret mounting the 76mm M7 gun that originated as an anti-aircraft gun that entered service in 1918. In game, it has a velocity of 792 meters per second. American tank doctrine at the time was drawn up in response to the German blitzkrieg tactics that were used during the Battle of France. This laid out that dedicated tank destroyer battalions would be kept in reserve awaiting intel that a mass German armored assault was going to take place. At that point, they would move up to hit the enemy forces. Due to the light armor of American tank destroyers, their primary tactics were ambush and hit and run. Of course, in the field, tanks like the Sherman usually had little choice but to engage enemy tanks, while the tank destroyers were held in reserve to be sent in quickly when there was threat of a concentrated force of hostile armor. However, by this stage in the war, concentrated forces of German tanks, as in 1940, were rare, if non-existent. The M10 wasn't as heavily armed as normal tanks. The theory was that as a result of it being lightly armored, it could use its speed and maneuverability as its defense. It also took advantage of sloped armor to increase effective protection of its thinner armor that ranged from 9mm to 57mm of its Sherman-based chassis. It first saw service in North Africa, proving to be an extremely effective weapon against the German tanks of that period. Later, it would prove ineffective against the front armor of German Tiger and Panther tanks, but it remained effective against the more common Panzer IVs. By 1944, it would begin to be replaced with the 90mm motor carriage M36. Anyways, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you found this video informative and helpful, and I encourage all of you to give your own tips and tricks for these tanks in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video, and with that, until next time.